In episode 3, we talk about battlefields, cemeteries, and sacred places, and the ways in which cemeteries, perhaps, or the lack of cemeteries, tell so many stories, and are also filled with silences.
I had read so many descriptions of what happened at Harama, the terrible cost, the terrible price that was paid. And so walking around there just sort of, it was like sort of a lightning bolt struck me.
Where I'd actually like to start today in our episode on sacred sites and cemeteries is to sort of just say how struck I was by your story about visiting, the grounds of the Battle of the Ebro in 1938 in Catalonia, and the footsteps, following in the footsteps of your uncle Ben Barsky and the Mackenzie Papineau Brigade. And, you described so well the drama of the landscape, Hill 481, the Pimple, that so disadvantaged the Republican forces, and where so many people, including Ben, lost their lives. And then after that story, you blew me away when you said that you actually found a Spanish death certificate for Ben Barsky. I just marvel at that, and I wonder.
I'll send you a copy. I'll send you a copy.
Well, I'd love to see that. So I'd be honored. But I have for our time today, I have a question, which is, just thinking about Spanish cemeteries and all I've learned about them. I wonder if the death certificate indicated that Ben was Jewish, because this is a key fault line. So. Yeah.
I don't think so. Let me look that up real quickly. But
I asked for many reasons. Cemeteries and the sacralization of death, involves religious rules in any tradition, right? And I'm reminded of the old Jewish curse, maybe you grew up with as well, that, you curse somebody when you say, "May you drop dead in a Christian neighborhood." Or the folklore about, if a Jew crosses the threshold of a church, you drop dead, you just die.
Well, I can tell you,
the
closest thing I have to that is when my cousin Dan Moskowitz, whose mother Gussie was my dad's sister, and who was the one that gave me this incredible trove of letters from Joe and Leo. Right. When he got married, I remember I was living in New York at that time. This is 1979, and he married a Puerto Rican woman, Cecilia, a lovely person. Of course, they later got divorced, but what are you going to do? Anyway, get to the wedding, which was held at the old Finch College building on the east side. I guess they turned it into some kind of hall. Anyway, I get there, and my Aunt Gussie and my Uncle Tommy, her husband, are standing outside. Everybody's coming in, and I said, "Aren't you coming in?" They said, No, we're not coming into the ceremony, because there was a rabbi and a priest, and they just, could not be there with a priest. And
wow.
And so that was like kind of hardcore.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. So it's an amazing story. I would love to see the death certificate. I'd be honored. Cemeteries are, and these spaces, these religious spaces carry so much history. And, my chasing of my grandmother's story in Pueblo Nuevo, all the way down in Andalusia, turned out to be so much about cemeteries.
Yeah.
And you probably know the church had virtually exclusive control over cemeteries in Spain. They were divided spaces, sort of like this wedding you described with the priest and the rabbi. But these spaces were divided. There was what was called a civil or dissident cemetery, and then the Catholic burial grounds, because the church had to be able to decide who's going to hell and who's going to heaven. And so for the unbaptized, for non-Catholics, for people who committed suicide, for people who had renounced their faith, they needed this plan B, this B-side right, for burial purposes. Um, and you probably know that with the advent of the Second Republic, and this was a source of huge tussling. So, the church's power to sort, right, bodies, was their power was almost absolute. They could call on the police, they could call on the mayor, they could call on the governor to enforce their will, and it's often divided families horribly when someone died. And so you probably know too that in the Second Republic in 1936, which is interesting for Ben Barsky as well, for his death up in Catalonia, that the Second Republic sort of secularized all the cemeteries, and that was often symbolized by tearing down this wall that would be between the civil and Catholic sides. But anyway, so it turned out that, in fact, the first thing that attracted me to writing the story of Pueblo Nuevo was the oral histories I had read, where resistance forces, resistance folk, were hiding guns in the cemeteries, and particularly in the civil cemetery, because it was always like full of brambles, and it was ugly and unkempt. So they staged they needed this civil cemetery, this sort of off limit zone where they would do their planning, their meetings, and hide their guns. I just thought this absolutely fascinating.
Well, it is, and I mean, part of the thing is that I don't think he was buried. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I don't believe he was buried, and so there's a desk. In fact, I have an English version of it too. I'll wait till after we're done. I'll send it to you. I was trying to find it now, but I don't want to waste our time here. But I will send you both of them, and you can ponder them and do as you will.
I'd love. Oh my God, that's amazing. That's amazing.
And I think I found the dressing station where my conjecture is that he was actually wounded, badly wounded, and then he lingered for a few days and died.
Oh,
And I went to that dressing station. I have pictures of it. I'll send you all this stuff. And then
wow.
this guy Alan Warren pointed to this area right behind the station. He said, "We think there are several hundred, people, in a mass grave there. So
Yeah. Wow.
someday we might, be able to find more with the DNA. I'm skeptical, but who knows?
Wow.
Well, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I've walked the cemetery in Pueblo Nuevo many times, and there is also a zone there dedicated to those who fell in defense of democracy and freedom, as it indicates on the marker. But there's no individual headstones. There's no names. Just by happenstance, I happened to be there on April 14th last year, and there was a lovely ceremony where people from the community came and told some stories, had some testimony about remembering their loved ones, and they laid some beautiful flowers in the colors of the Republic in the area, and then this little brass band played the Internationale, and I just thought, wow, it's just like to hear this transnational anthem of labor played was really powerful. And believe it or not, I was filming that day with my crew I paid for a couple of weekends there, and so we caught it all live. So it's just amazing. It's just really, really vivid and visceral to these spaces have so much history, and they tell so many stories.
Right. In 1975, my Aunt Gussie, my dad's sister, gave me this old ratty cigar box that was full of a bunch of letters. And it turned out these were letters that were written by her cousins, Joe and Leo Mendelowitz, known as Joe and Leo Gordon, from Spain. And there were also a group of letters that they had written in the early 1930s when they went on this amazing cross-country trip as teenagers. Joe was 16, Leo was 18. They hitchhiked and rode the rails all the way to California. And along the way, they would write these letters home. Neither of these guys graduated from high school, but they still had this kind of, real literate sense. At any rate, well, Joe Gordon was sort of a tough guy. He had a lisp. There's some speculation that because he had the lisp, he was bullied. And anyway, he made himself into a boxer, and
Wow.
quite a good one. And but Leo was a different kind of guy. He was much quieter, much more of a sense of humor, it seems to me. And after Joe Gordon went over to Spain in December 1936, he was among the first group of 90 or so Americans who went. His brother Leo followed the following spring. In the letters that Leo wrote, which my aunt saved, thankfully, um, he had a very difficult personal situation, unlike his brother Joe. Joe Gordon had been a labor guy. He was a strong arm man for the Furriers Union. He was in the Communist Party. In 1935, he was organizing cannery workers in San Diego. Uh,
Wow.
and he then joined the U.S. Army in 1936. It's not clear exactly why, but it suggested that it was at the behest of the Communist Party, who believed that they could sort of,
Oh,
subvert the
infiltrate.
army from within. That's right.
Wow. Wow.
And he was at Fort Hoyle in Maryland. And while there, he became the middleweight boxing champion of the base. And that gave him a certain amount of cachet. And you
Right.
read these stories about him, distributing copies of the Daily Worker in the bathroom or in the officer's mess,
Oh my
I mean,
word.
trying to imagine that. At any rate, after about 6 months, he deserted.
Oh my
He had some
God.
training, but he deserted, go to Spain in fall of 1936. And again, I think at the behest of the Communist Party. They were desperate for people who had any kind of military background. And so Joe went to Spain in 1936, badly wounded at Jarama. Then he was wounded. After he came back to the lines, he was wounded again at the Battle of Brunete in the leg. And meanwhile, his brother Leo came over in the spring of 1937. But unlike Joe, Leo had a very difficult personal situation that he was trying to negotiate. And that was that he had left his girlfriend. Her name was Agnes. Her nickname was Puny, that he writes in the letters. Don't know her last name. And Leo was much more of a happy-go-lucky guy. He was sort of more carefree. He was not as uptight, not as angry as his brother Joe.
Huh.
At any rate, Leo gets to Spain, and he's wrestling with this personal situation. He's writing back to his cousins, and he, left apparently without telling her that he was going. And he poured out his very mixed emotions in these letters to his cousins. Um, Justifying his personal decision and appealing to the bigger picture. And I'm quoting here from the letter. He said, "I'm sorry I hurt her. It's the toughest part of being out here. But look at it this way. On all sides of me in the camp, the same problem confronts hundreds of the boys. I talk to them. What's your solution? Stay home and fight fascism in the US while the fascists take over Spain? It's only a matter of time before there'll be very little choice as to what sector one will be able to handle a rifle in. Before long, Spain may be the quietest spot on the globe." And he had a lot of guilt about this.
Wow.
He said, why doesn't Agnes write? I haven't heard from her for a couple of months. Is there something wrong? Hasn't she received my letters? And it turns out that in New York, my two aunts, Gussie and Talma, the first cousins of the Gordons, uh, took Agnes to get an illegal abortion because she was pregnant.
Wow.
And it's not clear that Leo knew that, but I later learned that from them. And either way, the relationship, was over by the end of 1937. And so Leo was in Spain and quickly rose through the ranks. He was assigned to the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, the Mac Paps, which was supposed to be made up most all of Canadians, but in fact, the majority of people in it were Americans.
So that was
Um,
Ben's battalion too, right?
that's right. That's exactly right. In fact, I found them on the same. I have a roster sheet that shows them, and of course, Leo's cousin, my father, winds up marrying Ben's sister, my mother.
Oh
So
my
these family
word.
connections
So
are
did they connect while they were served over there?
who knows? I mean, I
Oh,
wish
you're
I
not
knew,
sure.
but
Okay.
I
Oh
mean,
my gosh. What a
I
mystery.
can't be
What a
sure.
mystery. What a mystery.
Some kind of cosmic coincidence. At any rate, Leo, you know, it took part in some of the heaviest engagements at the Battle of Fuentes de Ebro, and he was promoted eventually to lieutenant in charge of a machine gun company. And partly because everybody around him had been killed, and so he
Oh,
was he was given sort of recognition for keeping his unit intact. Um, and one of the letters that he wrote, I'll just read a bit of it. Sort of, I think, gives a sense of the solidarity, the emotion, and the pride. Now, these letters, of course, were also meant to bolster morale at home. I think that's important to note that.
yeah.
These guys knew that the letters would be widely read, maybe some of them be published. At any rate, he talks about the descriptions of deaths of close friends and comrades. And
Wow.
here's one of them. He's recalling Milton Herndon's grand charge through a hail of fire up a slope in front of the enemy trenches where his whole gun crew was wiped out. Now, I should note Milton Herndon was African American and was the brother of Angelo Herndon, who was a
No,
famous black organizer in
of
Atlanta. Yes.
course. Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
Leo goes on, they must have known they were doomed, but the order came to advance and not a man faltered. Let the fascists produce such evidence of indomitable courage. And little Jose Juarez, who crawled up a while later with ammunition, we had to point out the bodies of Milton and his comrades before we could take the ammunition away from him. And Jack Schiffman, who mortally wounded, kind of smiled and gave the red front salute before he collapsed. Likewise, Otto Reeves, a Negro YCLer from LA, who rode atop our tanks up to the enemy lines. With a bullet through his arm, he managed to drag a wounded comrade 2 kilometers back to a first aid station.
Wow.
And so, these letters include everything from this kind of very personal stuff about his girlfriend to these sort of homages to his comrades.
Oh, that's so
Uh,
beautiful.
but I want to just talk a bit about his death and what I found in terms of my visit to trying to
Sure.
find where he fell.
Sure.
So in March and April of 1938, we have what was called the Great Retreats. That is to say, the international brigades, the
Right.
Americans, and all the rest of them were forced to retreat from a massive offensive that was launched by Franco, of course, with the help of the German and Italian, hardware, the planes, the artillery, and so on. They were a fully motorized army, the fascists, which they anticipated
Right.
the Blitzkrieg tactics of World War II.
Right.
And in the Great Retreats, they had no alternative but to flee. And we're now here in the region of the Aragon. And on March 11th, the International Brigade leaders ordered the MacPaps to evacuate. They were in this town of Essaouira. Leo commanded 2 machine gun crews that were placed on top of a high cliff overlooking Essaouira. And they were under direct enemy fire. And when the orders to retreat came through, they were so far away they couldn't hear it.
Oh,
People
tragic.
shouted, they fired their pistols, they tried to attract their attention, but they were unsuccessful. And Saul Wellman, who was the commissar at that point in the MacPaps, wrote later on, he said, there was too much noise in the air for them to notice us. We remained there for almost a half hour, but seeing it was hopeless, we left and rejoined the battalion. Probably all of those men died there, holding their position to the very end. We know that those 2 crews held up the enemy advance on that spot between 8 and 12 hours. What exactly happened to Leo? And I finally dug this out through some research. A lone survivor who was a Canadian volunteer, a guy named Perry Hilton, was captured and spared only through a quirk of luck. Hilton's tall frame amused one of his Spanish captors, who was a short man, and the horseplay evidently took the edge off. A
Huh.
nationalist officer, fascist officer, later told Perry Hilton that all the men who had stayed behind on the cliff were captured, lined up, and shot. The
Oh,
officer also told Hilton that this was a mistake, as the fascist forces now had orders to take internationals prisoner when captured. If he was indeed captured, those orders came too late for Leo Gordon. He was 25 years old.
oh
So
my God.
I hate to throw around terms like heroism and heroic, but this really was, seems to me, a heroic death.
Oh,
Um, Now, many years
Amazing.
later, when I visited Spain, I made my way to Azuera and found the actual hill where Leo went down. And I also found was pointed out to me, a small Catholic cemetery where evidently these guys were buried. I don't know if that's true, but that's the story. And
Wow. What
so,
did it
like
look like?
some,
What did it look like? What did
uh,
the cemetery look like?
it's small. It was here's a little picture. It was right next to a sort of a wall outside this church,
Right,
and
right, right, right.
like so many of the other men who went down, there's Ware Town Cemetery, according to the locals, held somewhere between 7 and 28 men, likely Leo's final resting place. No, there's no marker there. There's no,
Right, right,
plaque or anything like that.
right.
So that was a particularly, sort of heartbreaking to see
It's
that.
gripping,
Uh,
absolutely gripping.
and actually, I'm at that on that cliff where you sort of see how open it was, and these guys really had no protection from the air, the airplanes and the shelling. And so I felt at least good about trying to find where he fell, and that was important to me.
Wow.
Um, Now I can keep going talk about Ben if you want, or you want
Well, I just want to
to. Go ahead.
just draw this out a little to say that
Sure.
your point about the letters having not just being morale boosters for the people back home, but in some ways I hear him talking himself into staying strong, right?
Yes.
And this whole question of keeping up the fight and how you sustain resistance when, of course, the Republicans, as you point out, they had donkeys and mules, and the fascists had airplanes and tanks, and it was they could see what a mismatch it was. And one of the ways that I learned that the rebels broke down morale for resistance was again in the care of bodies, right? So in Pueblo Nuevo, um, uh, one of the ways if you got slammed in jail, you were on the Republican side and you got slammed in jail. One of the ways they would reinforce their dominion was to, for example, keep families out of the jail. So jails were Spanish prisons, so notoriously rough places. But families, they were also centrally located in villages, and families would come in and bring blankets and they'd bring food, and
Right.
it was essential to your. In other words, your family's access to you in prison was essential to your surviving jail time.
We're staying
And so,
alive.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So one of the ways they demoralized the resistance was to keep women out, keep families out. Another way that they turned the knife was if your person died in jail, they would again toss their body, ignominiously into the civil, or as they called it in Pueblo Nuevo, the protestante, the
Right.
Protestant cemeteries. Being a Protestant was even worse than being, a dissident.
Right.
And yeah, and then of course, because the resistance was also real, I read all these stories about people going in the middle of the night, and this is especially poignant for women, right, who had a special role in making sure that their loved ones at the end of their lives were cared for properly, that you had a proper, that mass was said, that all the niceties. It's how you retain a
Sure.
coherent sense of who you are in the world. And so people would dig up these bodies in the middle of the night and move them. And so it was incredibly contested. These cemeteries were incredibly contested. They're actually a space where women had to be, present, and it was a bit transgressive for them to be, out and about and doing these sorts of things in the middle of the night. But I just thought this was absolutely fascinating, of rescuing these corpses and having them reburied. And it's just gripping, just absolutely gripping how people tried to hold together not just their principles, but just their sense of their family and their sense of the integrity of their attachment to their loved ones. It's just talk about heroic.
Yes, yes. So yeah, and I think that's all true and well said. There was a kind of interesting contrast, I think, with the death of Ben Barsky, my mother's brother, because compared to Leo Gordon, because and they were both in the MacPaps, and who knows, maybe they knew each other. It's hard to say.
Wow.
Uh, but Ben Barsky was involved in the last battled the war, which is the crossing of the Ebro in late July of 1938, when the Republic made a last gasp attempt to to say basically a counteroffensive against the Franco forces. And Ben was one of the men who made their way across the Ebro, rowboats, rafts, uh, almost anything that would float. And in the beginning, the tactic worked. It was they had an element of surprise, and they took the town of Asco, capturing prisoners and weapons. Then they moved into Corbera, which was on the Gandesa-Corbera Road, which was an important road. And in response to this initial Republican advance, Franco ordered a devastating counterattack, as we said before. I mean, massive amounts of artillery, the latest weaponry from Germany, and the fascist advantage in weapons, as you pointed out before, was decisive throughout the war.
Yeah.
And never more evident and frightening than in the Ebro campaign. From everything I've read, you've got German Messerschmitts and Stuka dive bombers that pounding the loyalist forces who had no air force. Um, the German 88 millimeter guns, which were cutting edge technology at the time,
Right.
easily destroyed the few tanks that they had. And basically, it's machine guns and rifles against tanks and Air Force heavy artillery.
Right.
At any rate, the Republican forces in late July or early August moved to take the town of Gandesa. And this is where Ben was. And, they tried to take this heavily fortified fascist controlled hill 481, known as the Pimple. And that's where he apparently got badly wounded and died a few days later in early August. Now, when I went out there to visit, what really was striking to me was we found the place in the bend of the Ebro where they had crossed. And then we found Hill 481, the Pimple, just south of the town of
Wow.
Gandesa. And Ben Barsky, whereas Leo Gordon and his gun crews fell trying to hold the high ground, Ben Barsky faced a reverse situation. So we climbed to the top of this hill, the Pimple, and there were heavily fortified fascist forces. And the MacPaps and the British battalions, the international brigades, were at the bottom of the hill. No cover, no
Yeah.
trees, no
Wow.
boulders. And the fascists are pouring down this heavy fire on the MacPaps and the Brits. And we're walking up there and looking down the slopes and the nearby plains. Where did these guys take cover? And the answer is
Right.
that they couldn't. How could the international brigades, badly outgunned, it was extremely hot, unable to protect themselves, ever imagine that they could take this hill?
Right.
And as our guide pointed out, the Ebro campaign featured the heaviest continual bombing of the war. According to our guide, over 40,000 tons of ordnance, bombs and mortar fragments, artillery shrapnel, bullets, 40,000 tons have been regathered and removed from this site, this Hill 481, for
Wow.
use as scrap metal.
Oh,
And right nearby that, after we came down, we found an old farmer's house that had served as the Republican field hospital, most likely the spot where Ben Barsky died from wounds that he got. And in the back of the house is an unmarked mass grave of several hundred Americans, presumably. That was Ben's final resting place.
my word.
And
My
so,
word.
you know, this was incredibly moving for me. It was very
How
emotional.
gripping. Oh,
And although it was very difficult to get to both these places, Azuera and Gandesa, I'm so glad I was able to do it. Almost like my own private homage, if you
oh,
will.
it's beautiful. Oh, there's
Um,
nothing like being there. It's just it's transformative. It's transformative.
yeah.
Believe it or not, my one of my last Becerra relatives is actually in the city government of Pueblo Nuevo, and she's actually in charge of the patrimony of cemeteries. And so when I went last summer, she actually we had a little family reunion and she gave us a tour. Now, as I said, uh, clearly the memory of the Republic is honored in the town, and those who lost their lives in the struggle on the side of democracy. But of course, my family story is not not on that side, right? My great grandfather Jose was at least a collaborator with the
Right.
fascists, and of course the family stories that on the Spain side are much more embroiled with some of the internal drama around
Family stuff. Yeah.
his secret family
Family,
and
right.
his family violence. So it was incredible because and after the turn to democracy in 77, all the cemeteries were declared civil. They didn't have this harsh dividing line between Catholic interments and civil spaces or dissident spaces. And so, when I think I told a story about how my great grandfather died in the house of his mistress, and this was an
Yes.
enormous shame to my
Yes.
great grandmother Anna, who was then deprived of all the dignities, right, of being a proper married widow, which is the waking of the body, the
Sure.
mass told in his honor, the processional to the funeral site, and of course the burial. He was buried. In fact, I remember visiting the old civil when he was still there, and it was a mess. You really couldn't walk. It was just absolute bramble. But interestingly, one of the things the family did after 77 was they moved everybody, basically. They closed the old nasty civil cemetery and they moved everybody. So they moved Jose Becerra, this fallen patriarch, to the main space, which is a big square walled environment with a lot of niches and a lot of tall stacks of these memorial plaques to family members, and that you keep your family together. I mean, this is a huge thing, right? You keep your family together
Yes.
in these spaces, and that's a lot of why people were so incensed when a priest would declare, no, this individual either committed suicide. You separate not only going straight to hell, but you separate the physical family
Yeah.
in the cemetery. So my cousin Mari Carmen had Jose's body moved, but she loves telling the story that she was able to situate him in such a way to honor one of Anna's requests to the family. She
Right.
died in 67. He died in 55. And though she had to put up with this great indignity of his infidelity and all of that. She always said, at least I don't have to be buried within eyesight of that man, because they would be buried in separate cemeteries. But my cousin Mari Carmen said, well, I was able to put him in such a place where I could honor her final, her request to not have to be in his presence. But I just, it's just so gripping to hear these stories in real time, and the ways in which I think, as your stories tell too, that this stuff follows us to the grave. These power dynamics, these
Yes.
sacrifices, heroics, these betrayals, they all follow us to the grave and beyond in the
Yeah.
generations.
Yeah. Well, the last of the three folks that I've been following that we've been talking about, I wanted to talk a little bit about Joe Gordon because, as I mentioned before, he had been one of the first people to go to Jarama. He was badly wounded there, lost the sight of an eye, was able to get to a doctor in Barcelona, then rejoined the battalion, was wounded at Brunete in the leg, and finally repatriated home. But that was a complicated thing because he had no passport. I mean, a lot of these guys had lost their
Wow.
passports and so on. At any rate, in June of 1938, Joe Gordon returned to Spain for another tour of duty, and also to try and find his brother Leo, who had been simply reported missing. A lot of times people were just reported as missing. They
Right.
no proof of death. So once again, he made the arduous trip to France and then across the Pyrenees. He was part of a group of 7 guys Lincoln vets who had been invalidated home and now were coming back. It was partly a morale thing, an emotional lift for the remaining Americans, but
Right.
it was more than just a feel-good publicity stunt. And so Joe served with the Lincolns again. He was a scout and an observer throughout the entire Ebro campaign. And by late June, he had given up on finding his brother. And this is one of the letters he wrote. There's something about this that is so, I don't know, cold. I'll read it to you. He says,
Yeah.
well, I guess you might as well stop writing to Leo. Tough break. He was really outstanding. He fought to the very end, and he took plenty of fascists with him as he went. And I think, the matter-of-fact tone must have masked his grief.
Mm,
an emotion that he could not linger on at the front.
mm.
And later on that summer in August, he described the ferocious fascist counterattack along the Ebro front. And now I'm quoting: "They are using tremendous amounts of planes, artillery, trench mortars, etc. We, as usual, have plenty of morale, faith, etc. The main thing is we are holding them. As Prime Minister Juan Negrin said, to resist is to advance, and that suits me. For
Wow.
example, he said, we are now in high mountainous terrain and covering has 1,000,001 difficulties. For example, we haven't had a drink of water in days. It takes 8 or 10 hours to get water. All told, we have been in action 33 days. Lots will help the soil of Spain grow richer. The rep go on and on. Heavy shelling is now taking place all over these hills. What explosions! 1,000,000 pieces of rock and shrapnel flying all over. The fascist planes are in the air continually." And along with these descriptions, he sent news of mutual friends, pleas for more packages. He said, "No need sending clothes outside of a warm shirt and socks. God damn, maybe you ought to throw in some heavy underwear too. Want to do me a favor? Slip a bottle of American whiskey in a package to me. This cognac is vile. We fight to the very end, and sometimes that looks like it's not too far off. But I'm not worried. I'm not supposed to worry. I'm a party organizer." So he was always thinking about, his
Wow.
responsibility.
Wow.
And here's another thing that I thought was really interesting. He was already imagining himself back home and re-engaged in the labor movement and radical politics. How would his experiences in Spain shape that? And he wrote to his cousin, "Somehow or other, I just can't get this picture out of my mind. A beautiful apartment with a radio, all modern conveniences, a group of comrades reading and discussing the struggles going on in different countries. But let me tell you something. It's a wonderful time reading about the hardships that people go through, about the mistakes that were made, etc. But when you go through the experiences yourself, baby, it's a bitch." And so,
Wow.
in fact, Joe did get home. He survived and got back to the United States with a bunch of other Americans in the fall of 1938. Despite problems with passports, it's interesting. The State Department issued what were called certificates of identity to American citizens without passports. That's what allowed these guys to get back home. Um, but and here's another thing that really tickled me.
Well, he sounds pretty literary. If this is the non-literary brother, he sounds
Yeah, I know.
he's just been
Um,
burnished by the experience.
I found these evaluations that were done of the American volunteers, and these became available in the 90s when the so-called Russian archives were opened up. As I think you know, with the collapse of the Republic, they sent all of their papers and sort of important documents to Moscow. And among those were all the papers of the international brigades, including the Americans. And so when we got those, all of a sudden you're able to see some of these things that you never saw
Incredible.
before. Um, John Gates, who was the last commissar of the Lincoln Brigade and later became a prominent member of the leader of the Communist Party, he wrote evaluations for those who survived for use by the American Communist Party. And of Joe Gordon, he noted, quote, "He was honest, loyal to the party, an active worker, disciplined, steady, and he's quite popular, a hard worker, sincere. His only faults," Gates continued, "were, quote, some rank and file tendencies." I so love that phrase. Like it's a catch-all criticism that could mean everything from excessive drinking to refusal to salute officers.
Maybe throwing a punch. I mean, he
But
didn't take no guff.
yeah, well, the thing is that he really also, I think, embodied what have found in a lot of these guys, which is this very deep rank and file anger,
Hmm.
at military mistakes, terrible leadership. And there's a great story that I discovered in a memoir by a guy, William Herrick, who knew Joe well, who was also wounded at Harama. And he tells the story that uh, Joe and Bill had met Ernest Hemingway in a
Hmm.
hotel in Valencia while on
Wow.
their way home in 1937. Hemingway gave them a bottle of scotch and the address of a high-class brothel where the women spoke English. So there's your rank and file. There's your rank and file tendencies. So just to bring this to an end, because we're talking also about graveyards, and this is the most unknowable grave of all. Joe's back in America. He, is a dedicated communist, a veteran of the Lincoln Brigade. He goes to a New York State CP training school. They're grooming him to be a leader, although he was, like I said, I don't think he had the right temperament. He was never, for example, promoted in Spain that I know of. He was never
Uh-huh.
promoted to be an officer, unlike his brother Leo, who became a lieutenant.
Yeah.
But anyway, decided to once Pearl Harbor happened, he decided immediately to join the Merchant Marine.
Right.
And he had to be careful because he had deserted the army in 1936, so he could
Right.
not rejoin the army.
Which name
Um,
was he using? Did that
well,
help him?
this is what's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so the real name is Joseph Mendelowitz, and signed up for the Merchant Marine a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. And what I found is in the documents, I found his what's called the Seaman's Jacket, which is the records of people who are in the Merchant Marine.
Yeah.
He carefully crossed out and changed his name from Joseph to Jacob on his application, in
I was
case
going to say
military
Yusula. He's
intelligence.
Yusula
Yes, sir,
Mendelowitz.
right. In case military intelligence came poking around.
Right.
And he had no previous service in the sea, but he had a supportive letter from the National Maritime Union, which was a lefty union. At any rate, Joe joins the Merchant Marine, and in 1942, he's on various runs on the East Coast. And then he ships out in December of 1942 as part of a convoy bound for Oran, Algeria. This was a part of the Allied invasion of French North Africa. That was an important point.
Right.
This boat is carrying all kinds of ammunition and explosives for this Allied invasion, and his ship coming into Oran January 1st, 1943. They're within a few miles of their destination, and a German U-boat torpedoed the Arthur Middleton in the bow, and the explosion apparently flames 1,000 feet high because they were carrying all these munitions. The boat sank within 1 minute. And there are only three members of the 81 person crew that survived.
Wow.
And in February 1943, Joe's wife, Sylvia Mendelowitz, who he had married shortly before going over, received a terse telegram. And I'm going to read the telegram here.
Yeah. Wow.
The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your husband, Jacob Mendelowitz, is missing and presumed lost following action in the performance of his duty and in the service of his country. The Coast Guard appreciates your great anxiety and will furnish further information promptly when received. To prevent possible aid to our enemies, please do not divulge the name of his ship. And it's signed by a Vice Admiral, the Commandant of the Coast Guard. So he went down. Of course, nobody was ever recovered. And his wife, Sylvia, who I talked to on the phone a couple of times many years later, told me that she had written several letters trying to find out more, and she could never find out anything. So,
Oh,
Ben Barsky in a mass grave, Leo Gordon in a mass grave, Bill Gordon, Davy Jones' locker at the bottom of the sea.
wow. Gosh, it's just,
And
just absolutely gripping.
The thing about him too is that, I think it really underscores the point that anti-fascism was the most important part of these guys' ideology. And the fact that you've been to Spain, you're wounded twice, and then you go join the merchant.
Yeah.
The battle was not won.
Right.
And
Right.
people, a lot of people have heard that term that was used of premature anti-fascists. That
Right.
a lot of the volunteers, were hounded after the war, and certainly during the Cold War. Because many of them were lefties and Reds and so on. There were many who joined the army, and many who were not able to join the army. Some of them became, won medals and became promoted into officers. But the larger point, the world historic point is this: in 1936-37, these people, not just in America, but the other international volunteers too, understood that fascism had to be stopped, and that you're going to have to eventually pick up a gun to stop it. And they were right.
It's gripping.
But it wasn't until 1945 that the victory was won.
That the job got done.
Yes.
It's incredible. It's an incredible story, and
Yeah,
there's so much to respond to. But I think I want to respond to your point about
sure.
sort of rank and file anger, sort of poor people's anger at the world and the way things are, and what you do about it. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I've been sort of exploring in my work and in Spanish history is this sort of, where does this rank and file everyday anger go? And you probably know this too from your own research, that a lot of it was directed at the church on the Spanish side. And so that republicanism, in some ways is, I don't want to say deformed, but it is deeply shaped by anti-clericalism and deep hatred of the church.
Yes.
And, it's sort of good news, bad news. On the one hand, it does focus people's behaviors and their interactions on a community level at specific people and at specific behaviors, because again, the church's life cycle, the calendar structures these small villages, and it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable.
Power was enormous.
Exactly.
Power of the church, especially in rural areas. Yes.
Absolutely. And yet at the same time, anti-clericalism did not build out a rich enough sort of Republican civil practice to sustain the other stuff that you need to do if you're going to build a counter-hegemonic, civil society. But so I was sort of going into my research in Pueblo Nuevo thinking, well, what is this going to look like? What is working class anger? What is the miners' rage? And miners are they're like Joe Gordon. They're tough. They're strong. These are not these are bold, people who are often considered dangerous. They handle dynamite. They're practically soldiers. In fact, there's a lot of resonance between being a miner and being a soldier. There's a lot of sort of gendered resonance. You wear a helmet, you have dangerous equipment, you take care of your fellows. So I'm like,
sense
okay,
of brotherhood,
so exactly. Yeah. And in fact, you could get out of military service sometimes if you were a miner.
Right.
Because coal and smelting and all of that was so important. So I'm like, okay, so here I am in Pueblo Nuevo, Andalusia, hotbed of anarchism. What is this anger? What is this working class kind of culture? It's kind of gendered. What's it going to look like? And, archives are imperfect and records are imperfect. You get what you get. And one of the things in terms of protest is, of course, challenges to the church, and a lot of everyday anger is directed at funeral processions, at the very sharp powers of priests to decide who's going to get buried where, and these are very intimate insults and intimate interventions in people's lives. But it's interesting what I found. I found less the sort of flamboyant, if you will, attacks on convents and attacks on the emptying of graves that happened, in Barcelona, the Tragic Week, 1909. These less of that, believe it or not. I mean, there's definitely, when people are angry, they run a gauntlet by the church and and Republicans. It's clear that political people are antagonizing the clergy and messaging the clergy, but not quite in the heavy ways in bloody ways, frankly, that happen in many other towns. And in the church archives, I found two very interesting things. One is that their anger at the church was less about disabling clergy's power over land or resources, so they did plenty of that too, and more about, no, you will recognize my loved one as deserving a proper Catholic burial. They wanted in. In other words, they sort of wanted in, as opposed to.
Sure.
I mean, they certainly messaged on the center left spectrum toward when they were angry, and just these incredible stories come out of the archives about everyday people not taking no for an answer, right? So this incredible story where a dad is worried in the middle of the night, his newborn's going to die. He runs out to the church. He talks to the sexton, my baby's going to die unbaptized, which means, of course, he's going straight to hell, and the child won't be able to be buried near the family. And the sexton says, hey, don't worry about it. Say this prayer, baptize the baby, and tomorrow's another day. Well, he obeys this instruction, and turns out this poor little infant dies. And then the next day, the family goes to the priest and says, oh, no, this baptism's no good. Your kid's not going to have a Catholic burial, and they're going straight to hell. And this guy fights it tooth and nail for months to no avail. But I mean, people take their anger and they go somewhere with it. It just really surprised me as to where they went.
Yeah.
And then, of course, my
That's
favorite
really
story.
interesting.
Yeah, my favorite story is the one about the madam of the local brothel who dies at home, which is of course the brothel, and her common law husband applies to the church for a Catholic burial. And of course, the priest is no way, this is not happening. She's a sinner. She's, a scandalous woman, a public woman. And, ordinarily they don't want to abet civil burials, but the priest is like, no, this is a bridge too far. And this guy who's his sort of common law spouse of the deceased says, okay, goes to City Hall, gets a civil burial certificate and the key, and then he and the guys in the neighborhood around behind the back of the priest bury this woman on the Catholic side of the cemetery. That's why that wall is so important that you showed me in the picture. And I just absolutely love this image of the community rallying to honor this madam of the brothel, and it's their cemetery. And in fact, her common law husband attests that she had renounced her sinful ways, and that she, was deserving of this.
That's what I love about Catholicism. Sorry, I didn't mean it.
Yeah.
I confess.
Yeah, and he brought testimony. I mean, this guy was serious. He brought testimonials and these are all saved in the archives. I'm like, they really fought. They really fought to claim so the church made these distinctions about Catholic sinner. But, the language is, this one letter is just so clear. The priest says that the people said the church, the cemetery belongs to the people.
Right. Well,
and it's just absolutely fabulous, but a little unexpected too. They want radically in, right? That's where their anger goes.
Listening to you, a couple of thoughts that I'll sort of, bat back at you. One is that it's really important, I think, that what you found, and I'm sure there are many examples of this, is sort of a counter to a lot of the propaganda that was out there. I mean, this whole image of the Republicans being these bloodthirsty people, and now, of course, there was some violence, but I think it's been, it was wildly exaggerated by the Catholic Church. And I know that in the U.S., where the Catholic Church played a terrible role in supporting Franco, that they brought pressure to bear on people in different ways. So, for example, you may know this, but in Hollywood, there were a number of liberal, lefty, well-known actors and directors who were raising money for the Spanish Republic, and people like Jean Harlow, James Cagney, and others. And Cagney was singled out by the church because he was Irish Catholic. And they basically pressured him to keep his mouth shut.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so the Catholic Church, as a sort of conservative, repressive, pro-Franco force in the U.S., made great use of these wildly exaggerated stories about raping nuns and burning down churches and all that. Now, again, there was some of that went on. The other side too is that listen, the church, I think, understood that this was a serious challenge, probably the most serious challenge to their power, which was huge, especially in small town and rural Spain.
Absolutely.
So it was a power thing, man. But I know that, again, on the U.S. side, this was a big deal. So it's really interesting to hear, as you say, that people wanted in, that they were not willing to be simply expelled or excommunicated or denied burial in the Catholic cemetery. They fought for that. And I think that's I think the thing of the anger, at least in terms of the a vet like Joe Gordon, an American volunteer, was more complicated because, on the one hand, a guy like Joe Gordon and almost everybody I've read about, if you join the Communist Party, if you see yourself as a revolutionary, if you're committed to changing the order of things, part of what you're doing is accepting Communist Party discipline. Yeah. And people were very proud. They took pride in that. I mean, everybody in my family did. And the idea was that, this is important to do. And so probably the most famous case of this, and I actually, there's some of this in things I found in 1939, when you get the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and the line changes, where all of a sudden, no, there's nothing. We're not. The Yanks are not coming. We're not going to go to war. It's an imperialist war. That's a very difficult 2 years or so for people who are in the Communist Party, because now all of a sudden, they're saying, no, no, we're not going to, engage in the war because of what Russia is doing. And let me tell you, there were a lot of people that breathed a big sigh of relief after the invasion of Russia in June of 1941, because that meant, okay, we're back on the right side here. At any rate, on the one hand, there is that sense of discipline that and you've got to take it seriously. And there's no doubt in my mind that a lot of, especially the working class people who are not that educated, the party became a way to organize their life. I mean, this was what they devoted themselves to. But the other side of that is this incredible anger and rage at stupid leadership, poor military decisions, and in the case of Spain, the sacrifice of thousands of lives. Now, Joe Gordon, as I said before, had been at Jarama, which was the very first battle where Americans went over the top. And the battle was a disaster. And you've got almost 400 Americans who were part of the Lincoln Battalion at that point, including Joe. And they went over the top for the first time in February 1937. They were trying to, this was right outside, Jarama was right outside Madrid, and they were trying to stop a fascist offensive. They were basically part of the defense of Madrid. And I went to visit there, and it's just amazing. And you see the trenches they dug. They're so shallow that they're digging trenches with their hands, their helmets, their bayonets,
Oh,
and you
God.
could barely lie down in one of these trenches,
Yeah.
much less get real cover. And they're clawing desperately the earth to get some kind of cover. And Joe Gordon was part of a machine gun company, and as often happens so often, when his group goes over the top, the gun breaks down, could not be fixed. No others were available. They're ordered to move up nonetheless. There was supposed to be all this covering fire and support that never turned up.
Ugh.
And in that night, Joe Gordon managed to survive, and he crawled to a first aid station and organized a stretcher crew to try to bring back people who had been shot, and basically spent the whole night, trying to get people back. And here's a quote from something he wrote, which was in a book called The Book of the 15th Brigade. It was the first book ever published about the international brigades, published in 1938. And he recalls the scene on that terrible night. Now I'm reading from what he said. Not moving, lying flat on my face, I was hoping the fire would subside a little so I could move on, but it seemed to get heavier. Artillery and tanks started to bang away. Bullets were spattering close. I decided to push on, knowing that if I stood on the same spot, sooner or later I'd get it. Pushing myself with my feet, using my hands, not daring to raise my body, I moved forward slowly. I got a cramp in my left leg. I also started to vomit. Resting a few minutes, then continuing forward, I finally came in sight of a dead comrade. Crawling up to him, I fixed his body so as to give me as much protection as possible. Soaked with blood, with continued running. I don't know how long I lay there. I'm sure he saved my life. In other words, using a body to protect himself. I
Wow.
was almost afraid to breathe lest I sniff in a bullet. What a night. Killing is a pleasure comparing to the saving of a life. In other words,
Oh,
the idea of trying to get these guys wounded and dead back in. And the next morning, in the safety of the trenches, Joe Gordon was hit by a sniper's bullet and in the forehead, and it cost him the sight of his left eye.
Hmm.
The big battle took place a few days later in Jarama, and Ernest Hemingway, who began covering the Spanish War in that spring, later described Jarama as the near destruction of the 15th Brigade he quoted, in one single idiotic, stupidly conceived, and insanely executed attack.
Ugh.
The Lincoln Battalion had 373 effectives on the morning of the beginning of this battle. A few days later, there were only about 150 men left. So they had over 50% casualties. Where does the anger come in? Well, after this battle, the battalion was pretty much decimated, and there was a tremendous amount of demoralization. And it's always been said if you weren't there, you couldn't really understand how awful it was. I mean, this is the ultimate
Ugh,
example of the international volunteers being used as cannon fodder, basically. Just get them out there,
yeah,
shock troops,
awful,
knowing that a lot of
awful.
them are going to get killed. Um, so Joe Gordon was hospitalized, and later returned, as I said before. But here's a letter he wrote back in December 1937 to his friend in New York, this guy William Herrick, who was also a wounded Harama veteran. And here's the anger that I've been talking about, Patty, where he says he's in Paris, he's trying to get home. It's very difficult because of passport troubles and everything. He says, after Spain and Paris, right now, I don't think very much of the majority of the party leaders. They are
Mm,
mostly petty bourgeois intellectuals, opportunists, bootlicking bastards. They better stay out of my way because I haven't heard the Marxist interpretation on the rights and lefts to the button. Once again, the boxing.
right.
Um, and I don't give a damn how big or small they are. The proletariat is the vanguard. What a laugh. All that matter now is getting home. I ain't interested in how the party squeaks or roars. I ain't worried about a job or how much money the Friends of the Lincoln Battalion put out. All I'm interested in worrying about is when and how I'm going to get back, and that goes for the rest around here. So there's a tremendous
Wow.
demoralization, tremendous rage. How could they mess up so badly? How could they have sacrificed all of these people? And they're referred to by party leaders as the demoralized element, right?
Ugh, yeah.
So there it is. That you can't find a
He
more
earned it.
disciplined,
I mean, he earned it.
right? But you've got to take out this anger, and so it's something that I think is different, than what you talked about in terms of the Catholic Church and all that.
Right.
But it's a sort of a motif that I found throughout a lot of this. On the one
Yeah.
hand, we're ready to give our lives. On the other hand, so many of our leaders are such assholes. They're
Right.
just,
Right.
and that's a
Wow.
great conviction, a great tension.
Amazing. I mean, it's so interesting to try to gauge um, the emotional temperature, if you will, of my own family about this conflict. And that letter is just it just goes right to the heart. I mean, this guy, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
if anybody earned the right to that position,
right,
Joe did. Joe did. Nobody
right.
did.
Oh,
Nobody
absolutely.
did. But it's funny, I was just rereading Paul Preston, A People Betrayed, which is about, I mean, literally has Spanish incompetence, political incompetence in the title. I mean, I hate those kind of books sometimes because, come on. But, I think what
Well, as Joe said in that other letter, when you're out in the real world, maybe it's a bitch.
it's a bitch. And, so I think I'm trying to gauge, this town. I'm trying to gauge say something about the affect, like the posture, how do you go on after these incredible betrayals, right? These betrayals and these beyond sacrifice. It's, as you
Yeah.
say, it's cannon fodder. It's not even a
Yes.
noble sacrifice, which there's plenty of room for in the Catholic. Sacrifice is an extremely high cultural value, extremely high.
Sure.
This really plays out in the village in terms of labor protests because as I think I've mentioned, these syndicates are pure pacifists. They are, talk about disciplined, they are pacifists. Nobody dies in the big strike of 1920. It's unheard. It's completely out of whack. They're shooting each other in Matewan, West Virginia. There's bombs going off in Asturias and Oviedo. There's political assassinations, Rio Tinto. Pueblo Nuevo, we have like Gandhi-like passive. It's staggering.
Well, it's a different
Um,
kind of discipline, right? I
it's a
mean, it's
different
also
kind of discipline. And so where I'm sort of landing with all of this is that, because leaders can't be trusted, there's this self-reliance and this, you might call it lack of idealism, but I don't think so. I
no,
mean,
no, no,
Joe is such an idealist, but it's this sort of
no.
cagey, that your self-reliance is about being really cagey,
It's also about
and canny,
yes. It's about
and
survival.
it's
It's
about
also about survival.
survival and not saying as little as you can because you just don't know who's going to be in power tomorrow. I mean, there's two
Right.
great examples. There's two great examples of this. One is I tried to get at everyday people by looking at prison records. I built a data, what things we do right in scholarship. I built the
Sure.
database. I found about 2,000 files I got access to at the provincial archives. Like this is where you see the state touch the everyday person, particularly poor people, because that's who gets
Yeah.
caught up with the
Sure.
Guardia, all that. And so a couple of really interesting things emerge. First of all, petty crime. It's all petty crime. It's literally a guy, teenagers going next door and stealing two
You know,
bottles
loaf
of
of
beer.
bread or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
stealing two bottles of beer off the bar
Right.
table. It's really small stuff. And similarly, the response of the state is actually similarly. It's all slap on the wrist. It's we detain you for 15 days. So it's like almost like this ritual,
Yes,
of wink, wink, nod, nod.
that's the right
Um,
word.
yeah. So I think one of the things that comes out of the prison files is that people are willing. They don't say a lot. They won't. They don't say a lot. I don't know. They're looking for Juan. I don't know Juan. Juan who? That's a classic. It drives the church crazy too, as well. I have a whole chapter on that. And the other thing that happens, it's less laudatory, perhaps, is they impersonate one another. They say, "Oh, I'm his," I'm actually, they go by
I'm
false names.
Spartacus.
They go by false names. So
Yes.
they to slip out of to slip away, because there's all these, complex apellidos, surnames. And so they slip around. It's almost like, the cheese and the worms. It's all
But
these
a
sort of
lot easier to do
it's
that
village
back then.
yeah, it's village
Before
intrigue,
driver's
right?
licenses and passports.
Exactly. No one's scanning the retina of your eyeball,
Yes,
or
yes,
and
yes,
in, and
yes.
in fact, the prison records have very few thumbprints. There's very little of that kind of intense politicization of the body, the sort of putting the body in as evidence. So that's one thing that comes through. And the other thing has to do kind of with my family, which is, um, having put down roots in that village of Pueblo Nuevo, and trying to parse my great grandfather's politics. He doesn't say much. He's not a guy with position papers in the newspaper. He's a finger in the wind guy.
Yes.
And I think there's a kind of rage that comes with that, which may explain his
Uh-huh.
volatility and his sensitivity, particularly about respect and his reputation, which he literally defended with fisticuffs and his heavy cane. But he's not an ideologue. He's not an
Right.
ideologue. He's not.
Well, I think that's also
So
a
I think
function of,
I think that's how I read it. That's how
yeah,
I read it.
I think that makes sense. And I think it's also a function of, small town and rural life, that
Yeah.
survival is really trumps everything. And, you don't have the big mass parties, you don't have the big
Right.
mass labor unions, it's not New York, it's not Chicago, it's not Madrid. And I think that instinct for survival, whether you're talking about political survival or, you know, uh, physical survival in terms of food and what have you, I think that's a big part of it. And very different than the the stories that I've been telling, and the the experiences of international volunteers, almost all of whom were motivated politically. Um,
Right, right. I
and
mean, it's really telling that in Pueblo Nuevo, of course, the village name Pueblo Nuevo del Terrible being the name of the shepherd's dog that supposedly discovered the coal and the first coal mine in the 1840s.
Love
And what is this? It's wonderful. What is the statue in the middle of the village? The
dog.
dog, el perro. Because it's sort of beyond, it busts all these categories. It busts left, right, it busts
Yeah.
out of the church, it busts church state. It's this really this animal is like this sort of mediating figure, right, between the human world and the natural world. And it's kind of it grounds them in what you're saying, a kind of a rural identity. Spain is a country of shepherds, right? Spain is a country of shepherds, which if anything has a Catholic resonance coming out of the Magi and the sort of the news of Jesus's birth, and the shepherds get the good news. It's the shepherds who get the good news, right?
And the priest is the shepherd of his flock, right? I mean,
There
that's
you
part of
go. But it's not. There's no statue to the priest. It's the dog with the teeth and the heavy collar. I mean, this is like it's a feisty. It's feisty, but it's not in these categories of either left, right, or church state.
Apolitical. No, it's not about politics.
It's bigger than all that. It's a little bit of magic,
Yeah.
a little bit of monster.